Amidst the city's relentless symphony of sirens, honking taxis, and the hurried footsteps of countless souls chasing their dreams, Mike Tyson walked. He wasn't the Iron Mike of old, the ferocious gladiator who once reigned supreme in the boxing ring. Now he was a seasoned veteran, a man weathered by life's storms, seeking a moment of peace in the urban chaos. His black-collared t-shirt, clinging to his broad shoulders and hinting at the muscular frame beneath, was a subtle shield against the prying eyes of the city. He moved with a quiet confidence, a rhythm honed over years of training and battles fought both inside and outside the ropes. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured, a testament to the discipline that still ran deep within his soul. He was just another face in the crowd, a familiar stranger amidst the teeming masses. But there was an aura about him, a residue of the legend he had forged. Heads turned, glances lingered, whispers followed in his wake. It was the quiet reverence for a titan, a legend etched in the collective memory of a city that thrived on its heroes. Tyson paused at a crosswalk, the neon glow of a nearby diner casting a lurid light on the grimy pavement. He pulled out his phone, his fingers dancing across the screen with practiced ease. He had a meeting later, a conversation he wasn't entirely looking forward to, but for now he allowed himself to be absorbed by the city's pulse. He was a part of this concrete jungle, a silent observer, a guardian of its hidden stories. Across the street, Officer Bradley sat in his patrol car, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The diner's retro sign flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows on his face. He was a man carved from granite, his crew-cut and stern demeanor projecting an image of unwavering authority. But beneath the surface of his official facade simmered a toxic brew of prejudice and resentment. Years on the force had hardened him, twisting his sense of duty into a weapon he wielded against those he deemed undesirable. He spotted Tyson. His grip tightened on the coffee cup, a surge of animosity coursing through him. Tyson, a black man who had risen to fame and fortune, represented everything Bradley despised. He saw Tyson not as a man but as a symbol of defiance, a challenge to his perceived order. The sudden whine of a siren sliced through the urban din, but Bradley barely registered it. His focus was solely on Tyson, a predator fixated on its prey. He stepped out of his cruiser, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. His hand instinctively gravitated to his belt, a subtle but unmistakable threat. As he crossed the street, the distance between them closed, the air crackling with unspoken tension. Tyson, still oblivious, glanced up, his expression shifting from casual interest to mild surprise. "Hey you!" Bradley's voice boomed across the street, sharp and accusatory. It was the voice of authority, the voice of judgment, the voice that had silenced countless others before him. Tyson, still a few feet away, raised an eyebrow. "Address me?" "Yeah you." Bradley's words dripped with condescension, laced with a barely concealed contempt. "What are you doing around here?" He paused, his eyes scanning Tyson's frame with a predatory gaze. "You look like you're up to something." The insinuation was clear. "You don't belong here." Tyson, recognizing the familiar script, sighed inwardly. He had faced this kind of blatant prejudice countless times before, each encounter a painful reminder of the deep-seated biases that still plagued society. "I'm just minding my business, man," Tyson replied, his voice even and controlled. "Is there a problem?" He refused to be drawn into the confrontation, refusing to give Bradley the satisfaction of seeing him react. But Bradley was relentless. He closed the remaining distance, his eyes burning with a righteous indignation. "You tell me," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't look like you belong around here." Tyson had reached his limit. The years of enduring subtle and not-so-subtle acts of racism, the constant scrutiny, the feeling of being judged for the color of his skin, it all boiled to the surface. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. But he knew that violence would only validate Bradley's prejudiced assumptions. He had to rise above it. With a weary shake of his head, Tyson turned to leave. "I don't have time for this," he said, his voice firm but controlled as he began to walk away. Bradley, fueled by his own prejudice and the thrill of exerting his power, wasn't finished. "Yeah, I bet you don't," he sneered, his hand now resting on his police baton. The menace in Bradley's words are casting dark shadow over the scene. Tyson knew now, this was not only about show of power but the beginning of conflict. A conflict to come as soon as he turned back. In one swift, brutal motion, Bradley's fist, propelled by rage and the arrogant belief in his own authority, launched towards Tyson's jaw. Okay, here's a significantly longer version of Chapter 2, building on the tension, detailing the fight, and exploring the internal thoughts of both Tyson and Bradley. The aim is to make it as long as possible while still maintaining a coherent narrative and simple language. The impact resonated through Tyson's arm, a satisfying thud that echoed in the sudden silence. Bradley's face crumpled, the cocky smirk vanishing as if wiped away by a damp cloth. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in a flash of pure, unadulterated anger. The crowd, a small collection of late-night wanderers and curious onlookers, gasped. The air crackled with a sudden, palpable tension. Phones flickered, recording the unfolding drama, the screens reflecting the harsh streetlights and the raw emotion etched on the two men's faces. Bradley stumbled back, his hand flying to his jaw, his fingers probing the point of impact. He tasted blood, a metallic tang that fueled his already simmering rage. He'd expected resistance, maybe a few angry words, a pathetic attempt at a defense. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't expected Tyson, usually so quiet and withdrawn, to possess such a swift, decisive strike. Tyson stood his ground, legs braced, fists clenched. The initial surge of adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, focused determination. He knew he'd crossed a line he'd been desperately trying to avoid. But Bradley had pushed him too far. He'd insulted his family, questioned his integrity, and finally, laid a hand on him. There was no going back. "You asked for this," Tyson said, his voice low and steady, but carrying a dangerous undercurrent. Every word was carefully measured, each syllable a promise of retribution. "You came here looking for trouble and you found it?" Bradley spat on the ground, a thick glob of red and saliva. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing the blood across his cheek. The humiliation stung almost as much as the punch. He was a cop, an officer of the law. He was supposed to be in control. He was supposed to command respect. Now he was standing in the middle of the street, bleeding and embarrassed, his authority crumbling around him. He tried to regain his composure, forcing himself to take a deep breath and control the tremor in his voice. "All right, Tyson," he said, attempting a tone of calm reason, though his voice was edged with a barely suppressed fury. "Let's just cool down. This doesn't have to go any further. I was just asking questions." Tyson scoffed, a harsh, humorless sound that cut through the night air. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, invading Bradley's personal space. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing the escalation, the point of no return. "Questions?" Tyson repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You call that asking questions? You threatened me, you accused me, you practically arrested me without a shred of evidence. And then you punched me. And now you want to cool down?" He took another step and Bradley unconsciously recoiled. He could see the anger burning in Tyson's eyes, a fierce, untamed fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. He'd miscalculated. He'd underestimated Tyson's resolve. He'd thought he could intimidate him, bully him into submission. But he was wrong. Dead wrong. "Look, I didn't mean for it to go this far," Bradley stammered, his confidence faltering. He tried to backpedal, to defuse the situation, but it was too late. The storm had been unleashed and there was no stopping it now. Tyson lunged forward, his movements surprisingly fluid and agile for a man of his size. He aimed a powerful punch at Bradley's midsection, a blow designed to incapacitate, to double him over in pain. Bradley, caught off guard, barely managed to raise his arms in defense, but the force of the impact still sent a searing pain through his body. He grunted, gasping for air, his stomach muscles clenching in agony. He staggered back, trying to create some distance, but Tyson was relentless, pursuing him with a single-minded focus. Tyson followed up with a flurry of punches, a relentless barrage of fists aimed at Bradley's head and body. Each blow landed with a sickening thud, each impact driving the air from Bradley's lungs. He tried to block, to deflect, but Tyson was too fast, too strong. The fight spilled out into the street, disrupting the already sparse late-night traffic. Cars honked their horns in protest, their headlights illuminating the chaotic scene, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the pavement. The crowd surged forward, drawn in by the spectacle, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Bradley, his face bruised and bloodied, his body aching with every movement, stumbled and fell to his knees. He looked up at Tyson, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. He was outmatched, outclassed, outgunned. He knew he couldn't win. But he refused to surrender. He was a cop. He was sworn to protect and serve. He couldn't just give up, couldn't just let Tyson walk all over him. With a guttural roar, he surged to his feet, charging at Tyson with a reckless abandon. He threw a wild looping punch, aiming for Tyson's head, hoping to land a lucky blow to turn the tide of the fight. Tyson easily dodged the punch, sidestepping Bradley's clumsy attack. He grabbed Bradley by the arm, using his momentum against him, and spun him around, sending him crashing to the ground. Bradley landed hard, the pavement scraping against his skin, the impact jarring his bones. He lay there for a moment, stunned and disoriented, his body throbbing with pain. He looked up at the sky, the stars seeming to mock his predicament. Tyson stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. He was breathing heavily, his muscles burning, but his eyes were still focused, still filled with that cold, unwavering determination. The rage was still there, simmering beneath the surface, threatening to erupt. He could feel the temptation to finish it, to end it all right here, right now. He could deliver the knockout blow, the blow that would leave Bradley broken and defeated, the blow that would silence his accusations, the blow that would finally give him the satisfaction he craved. But he knew he couldn't. He knew that crossing that line would only make things worse. It would turn him into everything he despised. It would make him no better than Bradley. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing himself to regain control. He unclenched his fists, slowly relaxing his muscles. He looked down at Bradley lying on the ground, bruised and defeated. "Get up," Tyson said, his voice low but firm, devoid of anger. "Get up and leave. And don't ever come near me or my family again. Understand?" Bradley, his eyes filled with resentment and humiliation, slowly pushed himself to his feet. He nodded weakly, avoiding Tyson's gaze. He knew he was beaten. He knew he had to retreat. But he also knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He would find a way to get even. He would make Tyson pay for this humiliation. He would make him regret ever crossing paths with him. He turned and limped away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Tyson standing alone in the middle of the street, the silence broken only by the distant wail of a siren. The storm had subsided, but the aftermath was far from over. The clouds still lingered, heavy with the promise of more rain. And Tyson knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the worst was yet to come. The flashing lights of the approaching police car painted the scene in stark reds and blues. Tyson stood frozen, the adrenaline slowly draining from his system, replaced by a chilling dread. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't planned any of it. All he'd wanted was to be left alone, to protect his family. But now he was standing in the middle of the street, the victor in a brutal brawl, and the police were coming. He glanced around at the small crowd, their faces illuminated by the flashing lights. Some were still recording on their phones, others were whispering amongst themselves, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and concern. He knew that whatever happened next, this fight would be all over the internet by morning. His life, his reputation, everything he'd worked for was hanging by a thread. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He knew he had to think fast. He had to decide what to do. Should he run? Should he stay and face the consequences? Running would only make him look guilty, but staying meant facing the wrath of the police and potentially the full force of the law. As the police car screeched to a halt, two officers emerged, their faces grim and determined. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head and a stern expression, immediately recognized Tyson. "Tyson Carter," he said, his voice booming across the street. "You're under arrest for assault?" Tyson didn't resist as the officer cuffed his hands behind his back. He knew it was pointless to argue. He was caught and he had to face the music. "I was defending myself," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He attacked me first." The officer just scoffed. "That's what they all say," he replied, leading Tyson towards the police car. As he was being shoved into the back of the car, Tyson saw Bradley standing on the sidewalk, talking to the other officer. Bradley's face was a mess, swollen and bruised, but there was a smug look in his eyes. He'd won in a way. He'd managed to get Tyson arrested, to turn the situation to his advantage. Tyson glared at him, his eyes burning with resentment. He knew that Bradley wouldn't let this go. He would use his position, his influence, to make Tyson's life a living hell. The police car sped away, leaving the scene behind. Tyson sat in silence, his mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. He needed a lawyer. A good lawyer. But he didn't have any money. He'd spent most of his savings on keeping the lights on and food on the table. He closed his eyes, picturing his daughter Lily. He imagined her face, her bright smile, her innocent eyes. He couldn't let her down. He had to find a way to get through this, to clear his name, to protect her. Meanwhile, Bradley watched the police car disappear down the street, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his battered face. He knew he'd taken a beating, but he considered it a small price to pay for finally getting Tyson where he wanted him. He knew he couldn't press charges based solely on the assault. That would open him up to questions about why he was there in the first place, why he had instigated the confrontation. But he could use the arrest as leverage. He could make things difficult for Tyson, make it impossible for him to find a job, to get his life back on track. He walked over to his car, wincing with every step. His body was aching, his head was throbbing, but he felt a sense of triumph. He'd proven his point. He'd shown Tyson that he wasn't to be messed with. He knew that his actions were questionable, that he'd abused his authority, that he'd potentially broken the law. But he didn't care. He was convinced that he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting his community from a dangerous element. As he drove away, he made a phone call. He needed to talk to some people, to pull some strings. He needed to make sure that Tyson Carter stayed behind bars for a long, long time. He intended to use every resource at his disposal to ensure Tyson Carter's life became a living hell, and his daughter Lily would suffer the consequences as well. His smile widened, but a sinister glint shone in his eyes. He was ready for war. Back at the station, Tyson was booked, fingerprinted, and thrown into a holding cell. The cell was small and dirty, with a steel bunk and a stained toilet. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and stale cigarettes. He sat on the bunk, his head in his hands, feeling utterly defeated. He was alone, facing an uncertain future. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew that it wouldn't be good. He was trapped, caught in a web of circumstances that he couldn't control. He thought about Lily again, and a surge of determination coursed through him. He couldn't give up. He had to fight. He had to find a way to clear his name and get back to her. He owed her that much. He stood up, his eyes blazing with a renewed sense of purpose. He might be down, but he wasn't out. He would find a way to win this fight no matter what it took. He would protect his daughter, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The echoes of the fight still rang in his ears, but they were now accompanied by a new sound, the sound of Tyson Carter, vowing to fight back. The battle had just begun. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers. Tyson sat at the defendant's table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. He felt 1,000 eyes on him, judging him, condemning him. He tried to focus on his lawyer, a young woman named Sarah, who was frantically shuffling papers and whispering reassurances. But his gaze kept drifting towards the gallery, where Lily sat, her small face pale and worried. He hated that she had to see him like this, accused of a crime, his future hanging in the balance. He wanted to shield her from all the ugliness, all the hardship, but he couldn't. She was his reason for fighting, his motivation to get through this nightmare. The prosecution laid out their case, painting Tyson as a violent thug, a danger to society. They presented photos of Bradley's injuries, emphasizing the severity of the beating. They even brought in a witness who claimed to have seen Tyson start the fight. Tyson knew the witness was lying, that Bradley had paid him to testify against him. But there was nothing he could do. Sarah, his lawyer, did her best to defend him. She argued that Tyson was acting in self-defense, that Bradley had provoked him, that the witness was unreliable. But it was an uphill battle. The evidence was stacked against him, and the judge seemed biased. During a recess, Sarah approached Tyson, her expression grim. "It's not looking good," she said, her voice low. "The judge seems to be leaning towards the prosecution. We need something, anything to turn this around." Tyson felt a wave of despair wash over him. He was running out of options. He was losing. And if he lost, he would lose everything. "What about Bradley's record?" he asked, desperately clinging to hope. "He has a history of violence, of abusing his authority. Can't we use that?" Sarah shook her head. "We tried. But the judge ruled it inadmissible. He said it was irrelevant to the current case." Tyson slammed his fist on the table, his frustration boiling over. "It's not irrelevant. It proves that he's a liar, that he's capable of anything." Sarah placed a calming hand on his arm. "I know, Tyson. I understand. But we have to stay calm. We have to keep fighting." As the trial dragged on, Lily became increasingly withdrawn. She stopped going to school, afraid of the whispers and the stares. She stayed at home, glued to the television, watching the news coverage of the trial. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Her dad was a good man. He wouldn't hurt anyone unless he had to. She knew that Bradley was lying, that he was trying to hurt her dad. But no one seemed to believe her. One evening, as she was watching the news, she saw a reporter interviewing a woman who claimed to have been harassed by Bradley in the past. The woman spoke of Bradley's aggressive behavior, his abuse of power, his attempts to intimidate her. Lily's eyes widened. This was it. This was the proof they needed. She grabbed her phone and called Sarah, Tyson's lawyer. "I saw a woman on TV," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "She said Bradley harassed her. She said he was violent." Sarah listened patiently, taking notes. "Okay, Lily," she said. "Tell me everything." The next day in court, Sarah called the woman to the stand. The woman testified about Bradley's past actions, detailing his history of violence and abuse. The prosecution tried to discredit her, but her testimony was compelling. The judge, his expression unreadable, listened intently. For the first time, Tyson felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Bradley, sitting in the gallery, seethed with anger. He couldn't believe that Lily, that little girl, had managed to turn the tide against him. He vowed to make her pay, to make her regret the day she ever crossed him. As the trial drew to a close, the jury began their deliberations. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Tyson sat in silence, his fate hanging in the balance. He looked at Lily, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. He knew that whatever happened, he had to stay strong for her. After what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The foreman, his face solemn, read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Tyson Carter, not guilty." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Tyson felt a wave of relief wash over him, so powerful that he almost collapsed. He was free. He was exonerated. He had won. He turned to Lily, his eyes filled with tears. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, sobbing with joy. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "We did it, Lily," he whispered. "We did it." As they walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand, Tyson knew that the nightmare was finally over. They still had a long road ahead of them, but they would face it together. They had learned the power of hope, the importance of fighting for what you believe in, and the unbreakable bond between a father and a daughter. Bradley watched them leave, his face contorted with rage. He had lost this battle, but the war was far from over. He would never forgive Tyson, never forgive Lily for humiliating him. He would find a way to get his revenge. The echoes of the trial faded, but the seeds of vengeance had been sown. And the storm, though temporarily calmed, was brewing once again.